An elderly veteran was quietly asked to give up his seat on a flight, just to make room for a family. He didn't argue. He just stood up. But 9 minutes after takeoff was delayed, the pilot walked out of the cockpit and saluted him in front of everyone. It was a calm morning at Gate 27 of Terminal C when passengers began boarding Flight 1842 bound for Denver. Families clutched carry-ons. Business travelers sipped coffee while tapping away at their phones, and the usual announcements echoed through the PA system. Among the crowd was an elderly man, perhaps in his late 80s, standing patiently with a small leather duffel slung over his shoulder. His back was slightly hunched, and the white of his neatly combed hair contrasted sharply with the faded olive green of the vintage army jacket he wore. He was first noticed by a gate attendant who offered to help him board early, but he politely declined, saying, "Thank you, but I can manage just fine." No one paid him much attention. He was just another old man flying coach. At the same time, a young couple with 3 kids, 2 boys and a baby girl, struggled to juggle bags, snacks, and tired little bodies. The mother, visibly stressed, marched up to the gate agent and asked if their seats could be changed so they could sit together. Apparently, the airline had placed the father and 1 son in row 12, and the mother with the baby and the other boy in row 25. The agent frowned and tapped at the computer, shaking her head as she explained that the flight was almost full. "There's only 1 seat free in row 12, she said. That was when the mother's gaze turned toward the old man, who had just taken his assigned seat, 12A, a window seat. Without hesitation, she stormed down the aisle with a tone sharpened by exhaustion and entitlement, and said, "Excuse me, sir, you're going to have to move. I need this seat for my family." The old man looked up, his pale blue eyes calm, and replied softly, "I'm sorry, miss, but this is my assigned seat." The woman scoffed. "You don't understand. I have a baby and 2 kids. My husband and son are in this row. You'll be fine somewhere else." Before he could reply, the flight attendant arrived, offering a placating smile. "Sir, would you mind moving just for this flight so they can sit together?" The man sighed gently, then nodded. "Of course," he said. "Family should be together." He stood, steadying himself with the seat back as he did. He didn't complain, didn't argue, didn't even frown. The attendant helped him locate another seat, row 29, between a talkative teenager and a man who didn't look up from his tablet once. As he shuffled down the aisle, a few passengers glanced at him but said nothing. The young mother, without a thank you, plopped down into 12A and handed her baby off to her husband with a breath of relief. The flight continued boarding, the cabin filling with noise and motion. But then a delay was announced. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are momentarily holding departure due to a minor technical check. We appreciate your patience." 9 minutes passed. Some grumbled, some closed their eyes, others simply refreshed their news feeds. Then something unexpected happened. The cockpit door opened, and out stepped the pilot. Not the co-pilot, not the flight attendant, but the captain himself, in full uniform, with a look of calm determination on his face. He walked slowly but deliberately down the aisle, scanning passengers' faces until his eyes landed on the elderly man in row 29. The pilot stopped beside him, and what happened next left the entire plane frozen in awe. He straightened his back, clicked his heels together, raised his hand, and gave the old man a sharp, respectful salute. The teenager next to him looked up, eyes wide, and the man with the tablet finally lowered it. The pilot said, loud enough for most to hear, "Sergeant Major James Callahan, retired U.S. Army, World War II and Korean War veteran. Sir, it is an honor to have you on board." Gasps rippled through the plane, heads turned, conversations halted. The old man blinked, clearly taken aback. How did you know?" he asked softly. The pilot smiled and said, "My grandfather served with you in the 24th Infantry. He kept a photo of you two in his wallet until the day he died. He always said you were the bravest man he ever knew." The entire cabin was silent. The young mother in row 12, who had demanded his seat, suddenly shifted uncomfortably, her expression twisting from irritation to realization. Passengers began whispering to one another, some even pulling out phones, but not to record, just to text family and friends what they were witnessing. The pilot extended his hand and James Callahan shook it firmly, despite the trembling in his fingers. Then the pilot turned to the attendant and said, "Get this man back to his seat, 12A, and let everyone here understand, that seat does not belong to a family today. It belongs to a hero." Applause broke out, slowly at first, then swelling into a standing ovation that swept through the cabin like a wave. Some passengers wiped tears from their eyes, others clapped with fervent respect. The mother who had taken his seat now stood, biting her lip, unsure of what to say. The attendant gently asked her to relocate to the back with her family, which she did, red-faced and silent. Sergeant Major Callahan was led back to 12A, where the pilot helped him sit, then placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "We wouldn't be flying freely today without men like you." The pilot returned to the cockpit, and a moment later the engines roared to life. But no one minded the wait anymore. As the plane took off, the atmosphere was different, quieter, more thoughtful. People stole glances at the old man as he looked out the window, his wrinkled hand resting gently on the armrest, his eyes glistening with quiet emotion. What no one knew was that James Callahan hadn't flown in over 20 years. This trip was his final journey to visit the gravesite of his younger brother, who never made it home from Korea. This wasn't just a flight, it was closure, it was memory, it was honor, and 9 minutes of delay had brought the entire flight to a halt, not because of mechanical trouble, but because respect had finally caught up to one man's life of silent sacrifice. But this was just the beginning, because what happened after landing would leave not just the passengers stunned, but would go viral across the world within hours, turning a quiet old veteran into a symbol of humility, courage, and the timeless call for honor in an increasingly distracted world. As the wheels of Flight 1842 screeched gently against the tarmac and the plane taxied toward Gate B11 in Denver, an unusual stillness hung in the cabin. Not the typical hustle of passengers unbuckling seatbelts prematurely or scrambling for overhead bins, but a quiet, almost reverent hush, as if everyone aboard instinctively knew they had been part of something rare, something sacred. Sergeant Major James Callahan, seated once again in 12A, stared out the window with misted eyes, watching the city unfold beneath the haze of morning light. He wasn't thinking of baggage claim or rental cars or whether his connecting ride had arrived. His thoughts were far behind him, buried in the past, walking among faces long gone, soldiers who never made it back, brothers in arms who still haunted his dreams. But what he didn't know was that while he sat there lost in thought, the pilot was making one last radio call, not to air traffic control, but to the Denver International Honor Guard. Because word had spread. Somewhere in those silent minutes after takeoff, a photo taken by a flight attendant of the pilot saluting Callahan had been shared on her social media with the caption, "Today, I met a real hero." That post was reshared by a military family support group, which was then picked up by a local news station, and within 45 minutes it had made its way into the inbox of the base commander, stationed only a few miles away. By the time the flight reached Denver, something extraordinary was waiting. The seatbelt sign turned off, and the pilot came back on the intercom, but instead of the usual "Welcome to Denver," his voice carried a different tone, firm, yet filled with emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "before we disembark, I ask that you remain seated for a moment. There is someone on this flight who deserves a proper welcome home." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the cabin as heads turned again toward 12A, where Callahan now looked up confused. "Sergeant Major," the pilot said over the speaker, "this is for you." The front door of the aircraft opened, and a soft breeze swept through the cabin. But what came next was not a normal disembarkation. Standing outside the jet bridge were two lines of Marines in full-dress blues, white gloves, and solemn expressions, forming an aisle of honor that stretched down the terminal corridor. Behind them stood veterans of every generation, some in wheelchairs, others standing proudly, their hats bearing the names of battles long past: Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan. At the end of this aisle was a man in uniform bearing 4 stars, a general, saluting before Callahan had even stepped off the plane. The pilot appeared beside him again and held out a hand. "Sir, may I escort you off?" Callahan, stunned and speechless, nodded as he rose slowly from his seat. This time, no one rushed to grab bags or beat the line. Phones were out again, but not to text or scroll. They recorded silently, respectfully, capturing a moment that generations would watch with tearful eyes. As Callahan stepped off the plane, every Marine along the aisle snapped into salute, one by one, holding steady as he passed. The general stepped forward and said, "Welcome home, Sergeant Major. We've waited a long time to honor you." Callahan tried to respond, but his voice broke. Instead, he simply nodded, pressing his trembling hand to his chest. What followed was a brief but powerful ceremony right there in the terminal. A folded American flag was presented to him by a Gold Star mother whose own son had died in combat, and she whispered something in his ear that made his knees tremble. An airline representative stepped forward and surprised everyone with an announcement. "We like to upgrade Sergeant Major Callahan's return ticket to first class, for life, on any flight he ever takes with us." Applause erupted again, louder than before, echoing through the terminal. The young mother from row 12 watched from the shadows, clutching her baby, tears streaming down her cheeks. She had tried to apologize to him during the flight, but the words never left her mouth. Now, she approached quietly as the ceremony ended, her eyes filled with shame and awe. "Sir," she began, her voice cracking, "I didn't know. I'm so sorry." Callahan turned to her and smiled, not out of bitterness, not to shame her, but with a warmth that could only come from someone who had seen too much to hold onto anger. "That's all right, young lady," he said gently. "You love your family. That's what I fought for." She nodded, unable to speak, and he reached out and gently patted the baby's head. "Take care of her. She's the future." What happened next took everyone by surprise. The general stepped forward again and invited Callahan to speak at the Veterans Memorial event taking place downtown that very afternoon. "If you're up to it, sir," the general said, "I think the city needs to hear your story." For a moment, Callahan hesitated. He hadn't spoken in public in years, but something stirred inside him, a sense that perhaps this was not just a coincidence. Maybe, just maybe, this was the world's way of saying his story still mattered. "All right," he said softly, "I'll do it." And that afternoon, standing before a crowd of over 5,000 people at the Denver Veterans Plaza, James Callahan took the microphone. His voice was quiet at first, raspy with age, but every word carried the weight of truth. He didn't talk about medals or battles. He talked about friendship, about loss, about the things he carried back with him, memories of fallen brothers, the pain of survival, the guilt of living when others didn't. He ended with one simple line that left the entire crowd in tears. "I didn't think anyone remembered us anymore, but today you did." The crowd stood in thunderous applause. News cameras were there, and by evening his speech was on every major network. Social media exploded with tributes. Soldiers from around the world commented. Children sent drawings. Schools requested him to speak. His story reached millions, and as he sat quietly that evening in his hotel room, he looked down at his trembling hands and whispered to himself, "Maybe I wasn't forgotten after all." But the story didn't end there. Days later, the airline announced a new initiative, a program that would prioritize seating and honors for veterans on every flight, dubbed Callahan S. Row. Airports began dedicating quiet honor spaces for aging soldiers. A high school in Kansas renamed their history wing the Callahan Hall of Valor. And at the White House, a letter arrived signed by the president, thanking him personally for reminding the nation that heroes walk among us every day, often unnoticed until someone stops to see. As for the young mother, she wrote a long, open letter, shared on her parenting blog, confessing her embarrassment, but also expressing her gratitude for the lesson she learned. "I taught my children something I never planned to," she wrote. "That humility, patience, and kindness can outshine pride in the most unexpected ways." That post alone was read by over 8 million people. Months later, when James Callahan passed peacefully in his sleep, the country mourned as if they had lost a family member. Flags flew at half-mast in 3 states. His funeral was broadcast live. The president attended, and the pilot who had first saluted him that day stood in uniform, delivering a eulogy that left everyone in tears.